mentioning, you showed this the other day and I looked it up, which is, what was the name of the...
This is a bottlenose dolphin, I believe.
Bottlenose dolphin, there was a bunch of them, but this was from the sounds and it had been translated somehow into an image?
Right. Well, what they did was they took Bottlenose Dolphin's song, and instead of doing it linearly, they translated it as a burst of sound. And then every time they do that, it comes out in the shape of a particular flower. And they color it by taking the lower the tone, the more into the red it goes, the higher the tone, the more into the blue or the ultraviolet or the violet it goes. And so, you know, I was getting from that, of course, because Native Americans would say every plant has a song, and so the interesting thing was the songs that the Native American medicine people were getting with plants sounds very similar to dolphin and whale song in some ways. And so there's some sort of, you know, dynamic that's happening where the earth is singing things into being in this particular kind of way, these certain oscillatory rhythms that are also a dimension of the reality of plant, dimension of the reality of language. And there's this whole kind of background of rhythmic and oscillatory patterns. And then when I saw those, the connection between native plant song and the guy at Aquasonics who's doing this work with these images, these three-dimensional gestalt images he's making of cetacean song and bird song, there's too much overlap to overlook it.
Yeah. Would you see any connection between that and the Shipibo patterns and their song, the ayahuasca songs? I've heard it's a musical notation of sorts, like it can be directly translated from...
I haven't looked that much into that enough to be able to say, but I'm sure there must be.
Yes, my interest in what I do is that the connection between something visual, or at least registers as visual, and then that energetic song dimension to it.
Right.
So for me, someone might come in, say, and they really have this connection to dolphins, and I would steer them maybe.
Oh, that's a nice idea. That's a nice idea. That's
captures
great.
it.
Yeah, that captures it, the song in that kind of visual form. Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Which is quite a thing. I wanted to ask you, would you be able to give, in a very simple form, for people to understand your way of perceiving the world with your understanding? Is that
a very simple way that doesn't take hours and hours to talk about it?
You know, that paradigm of where we're not separate and how everything is sort of, I don't know.
Well, the thing is, I don't know how much sense it'll make to take it, just a snippet of it, but, as I've said over and over, life is feeling-based, not thinking-based. And the thing is, everything around us that we encounter, if we just look at it and ask ourselves, how does it feel, we begin to notice the feeling dimension of things. So one of the examples I use all the time now is music, to say, I can hold up a musical score and say, well, this is this the song? And everybody goes, obviously not. But then if I sing part of the song, then they start to have that experience of the living reality that's behind that physical form, that map. And the thing that once you start to play a little bit deeper with this, and the thing I try to get across is that every physical form we encounter, there's that dimension of feeling behind it, okay? And that's what James Hillman called the response of the heart to what's presented to the senses. Macaulay Hari Bushman say that you must develop a library of feelings as you walk through the world. You must not only wake up your body when you get up in the morning, you must also wake up your heart. And you must begin to let the world touch you and feel what you get, because every feeling you get, it connects you to the deeper meaning that's inside that thing. So when you look at sheet music, you see a visual representation of the song, but you don't get any sense of the feeling nature that's behind those notes. But when you sing it, people begin to move into kind of a dream, and they feel all of these meanings that bypass the linear mind. They feel communications. I mean, Mahler said, if we could say it in words, we wouldn't bother with the music. And Duke Ellington said, you've got to find a way of saying it without saying it. You know? So that's sort of a way to get people to understand there's a feeling dimension to all sensory objects that we encounter, whether it's visual or auditory or whatever. So if you continue that further, and this is the part where there's a huge leap, that when you begin to work deeper, you begin to find, I mean, you can get there several ways. One way I get to it is to explain how that everything is highly intelligent. And one of the things that the new book will talk about, and I talked about during this workshop, was the neural networks that exist on the Earth are extremely extensive, that plants actually have a neural network, a brain that's far more sophisticated in some instances than the human, even though we're taught to denigrate that by, you know, the guy's in a coma, he's a vegetable, you know. Mm-hmm. And bacteria have a neural network that far exceeds our own, and they have language and processing and everything else. That's one way I get there. But another way to understand is that the environment and the things we see as objects are so tightly interwoven that you can't really see them as separated things. And one of the things I sort of developed over the 5 days was that when every object we encounter is in actuality a condensed meaning. It's a node of meaning. It's environment condensed down to a very concentrated form of meaning, and there's threads of connection between everything out there. We're just part of that scenario. It's a living, moving scenario in which everything's highly intelligent and aware. And the Kalahari Bushman would talk about how there's these threads or ropes of connection, and sometimes you feel them tapping on you and you begin to follow them, and they sort of lead you through the world into deeper meanings. And so, in a sense, without all of the preparatory development, it makes it a little difficult to understand this, but more and more and more people see the reality that this is the reality of the world in which we find ourselves, not sort of the static backdrop across which we move. Whenever we encounter some biological organism in the world, it's just as highly intelligent and aware as us. Researchers know that bacteria have a highly developed language, highly developed tool-making capacity. They have culture, they have cultural memory. Some of them even make electricity to warm their cities, which are called biofilms. So, you know, as Henry David Thoreau once said, you know, you must understand nothing is what you've taken it to be. We understand less than 1% of the reality of the world, and part of the reason we're experiencing such ecosystem flux now is because we're treating the world as if it's something it's not and never has been. And our access to the metaphysical background of the world, to the deeper nature of everything, is really feeling, not thinking. Because whenever we encounter a feeling, there's a meaning inside that feeling. Like, you come home from work, you go to your beloved, how are you? And they go, fine. You know that they're not fine. There's a meaning in that word different than what the word appears to say. And that's sort of a really simple way of summing up that there's complex meanings inside things.
Mm-hmm. That was throughout your workshop, I was just remembering different experiences with my work and with interactions with people, and I noticed that when people, like you're saying, kind of force that view that we're separate, things start to go wrong. And when people are much more immersed, or you know, if you're feeling loving towards an animal or a baby, things shift, and then there's just something softer and more flowing about reality at that time. Like there's definitely a palpable shift, but a lot of people live their life feeling they're separate. And I feel like it's kind of like if your leg is numb or something and you don't acknowledge that it's your leg, it's much easier to destroy it,
right?
Not identifying it as
part. That's a nice way of looking at it. I mean, people dissociate from their bodies all the time because we're taught that we live up here, but it's an interesting thing. If the human being is getting ready to cross the street and there's a truck coming, they can look at that truck and extremely rapidly determine whether or not they can make it across the street. But if a physicist had to figure it out, they would have to know, you know, the friction dynamics on the road, and they'd have to know about the tires, they'd have to know about how fast the truck is moving, they'd have to know the length, the leg length of the step and the person's movement. It would take them hours to figure out whether you could make it across the street, yet we can do it with some other part of ourself than our brain in just a millisecond of time. So, and it's a feeling thing. You feel, you know, you look at the truck, you look at the distance, and you can actually feel, you get a little signal that says, yes you can, it's a feeling thing, or no you can't. It's not a thinking thing. And so, that feeling dynamic connects us to the movements in the world, but more than that, we can actually understand very complex dynamics that go on in ecosystems just through that deep, immediate feeling sense. But if you start trying to do it from up here, you get lost. The brain is a wonderful servant, it's a terrible master.
I read, or no, actually, I think I saw it somewhere. Someone was mentioning how, I mean, most people know that you go for a walk in nature and you feel relaxed and sort of rejuvenated in some way, refreshed. And he was saying that through some studies, that it's not just because you're relaxing yourself and getting a breath of fresh air, that there's this other thing going on, this connection, that you're actually being fed by something by walking through the forest, that it's so much more.
Yeah, and it's really complicated because, I mean, there's a lot of factors involved. For one thing, the rhythms of plants are much slower than human beings, and we naturally tend to entrain with other living organisms, like we walk down the street and we match our walking with the person we're with. We begin to slow down in forests because the trees move at a much slower pace than we do. Another thing is the Japanese, many of them are really into a thing called forest bathing for health. And so they walk through pine forests because they're bathed in the terpenes that the forests are giving off, is that they're breathing out through their stomata. And so you're being bathed literally, and it's a kind of aromatherapy that you breathe in that automatically begins to change lung function, immune function, adrenal function. I mean, everybody's had that experience of you walk into the forest and you get that smell of a pine thing, and you just relax. So there's a lot of different factors involved in that process. Also the fact that the human neural system tends to work better in wild landscapes than it does in Euclidean cities.
I won't keep you much longer. I know you've got a lot of things to do. But
Mostly I just have to pass out soon.
Oh, good. One other question to you as an herbalist, as a master herbalist. I was chatting with some people earlier in the week about the idea of putting some kind of herbal additive into the ink, and the possibility on many levels of facilitating. I mean, it's not like it's going to be a lot, but to, in some way, energetically facilitate the process for people who are, you know, going through something and trying to go into a deeper level within themselves and connect to something, and, you know, to further facilitate that. And Seja had mentioned possibly Devil's Club and Wild Rose and White Sage as just something that came to him. I don't know if you would have any.
Well, it's a really interesting idea. Weren't the original, the indigenous tribes that got into tattooing, didn't they use vegetable dye substances a lot of the time for that? It'd be an interesting idea to start to blend vegetable dye substances that actually would have some sort of impact on the feeling body like that. That's a fascinating idea. That's a really nice idea. I haven't gotten any place like that. That's a new idea for me. What a nice idea.
Well, I mean, the difficult thing with tattooing is you probably and most people would have a sense that a lot of the types of ingots nowadays get a lot of iron oxides and things to keep them permanent,
Right.
to hold some of that vibrancy, whereas a lot of the older inks that we're taking from the ground or from plants would fade to.
Would they even in because where were they, the Maori, or who was it in New Zealand that had all those amazing tattoos? Is that who it was?
Yeah,
I mean, they didn't fade on those guys, did they?
They didn't fade, but they went kind of I think it looked good. It was more of an organic feel as opposed to some sort of shocking black or what have you. But it definitely degrades a little bit.
Does it?
Yeah. But I'm just thinking more of it from the energetic aspect. Like,
well, you could use almost anything. You could use almost anything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many plants have so many different feeling dynamics to them. What an interesting idea for somebody to find a plant that would match the spiritual thing they're struggling with, and that you have it as part of the dye when you're working on their skin. I mean, that's a great idea.
Do you have any suggestions? Like me, who has no background in herbalism, how I would
Well, but for me, all plants have that capacity. So I look at what, for instance, I mean, pasque flower is a great plant for me. If you feel like you've lost your childlike self and your wonder in the world and your happiness of being alive, that's the plant I work with for that. If you feel like you're falling apart, I use coral root. If you feel like you have no strength and no center, I work with oak. So like somebody might need an astringent plant for some condition they have, and so could you give them an astringent plant? But wild geranium is highly astringent, or chromeria is very astringent. So, but then I look at the other dynamics, and if they feel very weak in their center, like they have no strength, then I would probably choose oak instead, because it has that quality. And even though it seems an extremely tenuous dynamic to bring in, real reductive people get all twitchy when you talk like this about it, but nevertheless, there's some quality in that plant that is actually transferred in the medicine to the people. So yeah, you can say I'm using an astringent, but I'm using this one because of that reason. And after 30 years of work, I've seen it have impacts over and over and over again.
When you say astringent, just
a drying thing, like it dries. Like if you've got a wound and you're bleeding, and you put an astringent herb on it, it'll dry it. It'll stimulate clotting, let's say, and dry it out. If you've got a CP wound or something like that, there's a lot of plants that are really drying that way, but they each have a little bit different quality to them.
And as far as putting something into the ink as an additive, would you would it be a tincture?
I mean, you're getting into an area like I haven't even thought about. It's like it's like, because I don't even know how the ink dynamic works in this stuff. It's like I don't even know what it's composed of. I know that people used to use oak galls to make ink to write with, for instance. So, but they would use, it would be, as far as I remember from memory, which is often unreliable these days, it would be water-based, not anything else. So, but I don't know anything about the structure of inks or anything like that at all. So,